They gathered to bid on a human soul, but one man came to offer something else entirely: a reckoning. The town square was a crucible, baked by a sun that offered no grace, only a sterile, white-hot glare that bleached the color from the dust-caked buildings and the hard-set faces of the people who had assembled. They were farmers, merchants, trappers, men whose hands were calloused by labor and whose hearts were calloused by the casual cruelties of a hard land. They stood in a loose semicircle, their shadows stretching long and distorted behind them. A congregation gathered for a profane ritual. At the center of it all, on a crude wooden platform erected for the occasion, stood the reason for their gathering. She was a girl, barely a woman, her name erased and replaced by the generic, dismissive label of her people. Her hands were bound before her with rough hemp rope, the fibers already chafing her skin raw. Yet she stood with a stillness that was a defiance in itself, her chin held at an angle that spoke of a pride they could not purchase or beat out of her. At the edge of the crowd, half swallowed by the shadow of the blacksmith's shop, a man watched. His name was Cale, though no one here knew it. He was a specter at their feast, a silent observer whose presence was an anomaly. He was not of this town, nor did he share their feverish anticipation. He was lean, forged by a life that had stripped him of all that was soft, leaving only sinew and scars. A long, unadorned bow was slung across his back, its wood dark and seasoned, a stark contrast to the firearms holstered on the hips of other men. It was an antiquated thing, a relic much like the man who carried it. He watched the girl on the block, and the arid heat of the day did nothing to warm the profound winter in his soul. He saw the subtle tremor in her hands, the rigid set of her jaw, the vast, wild terror she was holding back behind her dark, steady eyes. And in her, he saw a ghost, a memory that had haunted his waking hours and tormented his sleep for years, a debt he had long since despaired of ever repaying. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and cheap whiskey, a scent he associated with the absolute worst of men. The murmur of the crowd was a low, hungry growl, and Cale felt an old familiar rage begin to stir within him, a serpent uncoiling in the pit of his stomach. He had not come here seeking a fight. He had come here following a rumor, a whisper on the wind that had led him to this sun-scorched purgatory, a place where the ugliest of human traditions persisted like a stubborn weed. He had come to see if the whispers were true, and now, seeing her, he knew they were. The past was not dead. It wasn't even past. It was here, standing on a wooden block under the merciless sun, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. Cale's gaze did not waver. The world seemed to narrow, the faces of the crowd blurring into a single, monstrous entity, leaving only him, the girl, and the ghosts that stood between them. The auctioneer, a man named Bartholomew, stepped onto the platform. He was a portly man, sweating profusely in a waistcoat that was too tight and too fine for such a place. He mopped his brow with a silk handkerchief, a gesture of civility that was utterly obscene in its context. He smiled, a wide, predatory expression that revealed teeth stained by tobacco. "Gentlemen," he boomed, his voice unnaturally loud in the tense air. "A fine afternoon for commerce, is it not? A rare opportunity has presented itself today. A piece of untamed wilderness, ready to be domesticated. Strong, healthy, and with a spirit that a firm hand will surely know how to guide." His words were slick with euphemism, a thin veneer of respectability painted over a grotesque truth. A few men chuckled, a harsh, guttural sound. Cale's hand, resting on the worn leather strap of his satchel, clenched into a fist. He could feel the phantom sensation of rope on his own wrists, the memory of a similar day, a similar voice. The bidding began. "Shall we start the bidding at $20? A pittance for such a fine specimen. Who will give me 20? A grizzled rancher with a weathered face and cruel small eyes lifted a finger. 20. The word was flat, emotionless, the sound of a man buying livestock. The auctioneer's smile widened. $20 from Mr. Abernathy, a man who knows value when he sees it. Do I hear 30? $30? Another man, a merchant Cale recognized from the town's general store, raised his hand. 30. The price climbed in increments of $5 and $10, each bid a new link in the chain being forged around the girl's future. She did not flinch. Her eyes swept over the crowd, a queen surveying a pit of vipers. For a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, her gaze met Cale's. There was no plea in her eyes, no appeal for help. There was only a shared, stark acknowledgement of the horror of the moment. It was a connection forged in the crucible of absolute degradation, a silent understanding that passed between two souls on the periphery of this world. Cale felt the serpent of his rage coil tighter. It was a cold fury now, honed and patient. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, pierced through his concentration. Anya, the sun in her hair as she laughed, the scent of wild sage on her skin. Then another image, superimposed over the first. Anya on a block just like this one, her eyes wide with a terror that broke his heart. A terror he was powerless to stop. He had been wounded then, captured alongside her, forced to watch from the dirt as they sold her spirit away. He could still hear the sound of the gavel, a sound like a bone snapping. He pushed the memory down, burying it deep, but its poison remained, fueling the dark resolve that was now solidifying within him, turning from thought into pure, unyielding intent. The bidding was at $70. The girl, Ilara, he had heard her name whispered by the women of the town, a name they spoke with a mixture of pity and fear, remained impassive, a statue carved from defiance. Cale's world had become a vortex of sound and sensation, all of it spiraling inward. The auctioneer's droning voice, the grunts and callous shouts of the bidders, the oppressive weight of the sun, it all receded, becoming a distant hum. What remained was the thrumming in his own blood, the rhythmic beat of a war drum that only he could hear. This was the precipice he had walked for years, the edge of a chasm that separated the man he was from the man he had been forced to become. He had tried to bury that other man, the warrior, the one who lived by a code written in blood and honor. He had traded his lance for a farmer's hoe, his war paint for the dust of the road, seeking a kind of anonymous peace. But peace was a lie. It was a shallow pond that only reflected the storm clouds gathering above. Looking at Ilara on that block, he understood that there was no running from what he was. His past was not a shadow he could outrun. It was sewn into his very being, etched into the scars on his skin and the permanent winter in his eyes. He felt a profound, soul-deep weariness. It would be so easy to do nothing, so easy to turn and walk away, to melt back into the shadows and let this town consume her, just as that other town had consumed Anya. It would be the safe choice, the choice that would allow him to live, to continue his lonely, ghost-haunted existence. But what kind of life was that? To survive while his soul withered and died? To carry the weight of 2 lost women instead of 1? The thought was unbearable, a physical weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He remembered the promise he had made to Anya's memory, a silent vow whispered into the uncaring darkness of 1,000 nights. Never again. It was a promise born of failure, a penance for his own weakness on that terrible day. He had been helpless then, but he was not helpless now. He was stronger. He was colder. He was a weapon that had been left to rust in the rain, but the edge was still there, waiting to be honed. The bow on his back felt heavier than it ever had before, not with the weight of wood and sinew, but with the weight of decision. To use it would be to unleash the part of himself he feared the most, the violence he had tried so desperately to cage. It would mean an end to his quiet exile. It would mean blood, but to leave it on his back would be a betrayal far greater, a sin against the only thing he had left to honor, his grief. The bidding had stalled at $95. The auctioneer was working the crowd, trying to coax another bid. Kyl's hand, which had been a fist, slowly uncurled. His fingers were steady. The internal battle was over. There was no choice, not really. There was only the vow. There was only the ghost of Anya, her silent expectation. There was only the girl on the block, her life measured in silver coins. A profound, almost serene calm settled over him. The serpent of his rage was no longer coiled. It was poised, ready to strike. A new player entered the bidding, and the atmosphere in the square shifted. His name was Sterling, a man whose wealth was as vast as his cruelty was deep. He was dressed in fine city clothes that looked absurdly out of place in the dust and squalor, a stark symbol of his detachment from the common struggles of the men around him. He had been observing from the veranda of the town's only hotel, sipping a drink, the entire affair a piece of midday theater for his amusement. Now, he descended the steps, his polished boots kicking up small puffs of dust. He didn't shout a bid. He simply raised a single manicured finger, his expression one of bored arrogance. $150, he said, his voice clear and cutting, slicing through the murmur of the crowd. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. The bid was an obscene jump, designed not just to win, but to dominate. It was a declaration of power, a casual dismissal of every other man present. The rancher, Abernathy, and the merchant both shrank back, their modest means no match for this level of casual extravagance. Sterling was not just buying a person, he was buying the silence and submission of the entire town. The auctioneer, Bartholomew, practically preened, his eyes gleaming with greed. $150 from the esteemed Mr. Sterling, a bid of true distinction. He looked around, a mocking challenge in his eyes. Do I hear 160? Can anyone match this man of substance? There was only silence. The spectacle was over. The transaction was nearly complete. Sterling's gaze drifted to the platform, and he looked at Alara not as a human being, but as a fine horse or a piece of art he had just acquired. He smiled, a thin, proprietary smirk. It was then that Alara's iron composure finally fractured. She had withstood the stares, the jeers, the degradation, with a stoicism that was almost inhuman. But the finality of it, the sight of the man who would now own her, broke through her defenses. A single tear escaped and traced a slow, clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was not a sign of weakness, but a final, desperate act of rebellion from a spirit that refused to be completely extinguished. From his position in the shadows, Cale saw it. In the harsh, unforgiving sunlight, the tear glittered like a diamond. It was a small thing, a tiny drop of salt water in grief, but for Cale it was an avalanche. It was the signal he had been waiting for, the final push he needed. The sight of that one tear broke the dam of his restraint, and all the pain, all the rage, all the guilt he had held inside for so long surged forth, not as a chaotic flood, but as a single, focused, unstoppable current. The weariness fell away from him, replaced by a clarity of purpose so sharp it was almost painful. He took a single, deliberate step out of the shadows and into the sun. The movement was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was a crossing of a threshold. He was no longer an observer. He was a participant. The fuse had been lit, and the slow burn of the last few years was about to end in fire. The scuff of Cale's boot on the hard-packed earth was a small sound, yet it drew a few eyes. As he continued to walk, a path began to clear before him, the townsfolk instinctively parting as if for a leper or a king. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was utterly at odds with the tense, greedy energy of the square. He wasn't hurrying. He was an inevitability. He stopped in the open space between the crowd and the platform, a solitary figure in the oppressive heat. The auctioneer Bartholomew paused mid-sentence, his face a mask of annoyance at the interruption. "Well now," he said, forcing a condescending chuckle, "it seems we have a latecomer to the proceedings. Do you have a bid to offer, stranger? Or are you simply here to block the sun?" A few of Sterling's lackeys snickered. Sterling himself merely raised an eyebrow, viewing Kyle as one might view an insect that had crawled onto his dinner plate. Kyle said nothing. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. The entire square seemed to hold its breath. In that silence, Cale's actions spoke with a devastating eloquence. With a slow, fluid motion, he reached over his shoulder and unslung the longbow. The crowd, which had been expecting coins, murmured in confusion. The bow was a thing of stark, brutal beauty, its dark wood polished smooth by years of use, its string a taut line of promise. It was not a gentleman's weapon. It was a killer's tool. Sterling's look of bored amusement curdled into a sneer. "What is this? Does the savage think he can pay with sticks and string?" he called out, his voice dripping with contempt. The auctioneer, growing flustered, pointed a chubby finger at Kyle. "Sir, I must insist you state your price or remove yourself immediately. This is a place of civilized business." Kyle ignored them both. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere beyond them, a place of memory and resolve. He reached into the quiver on his back, his fingers closing around the fletching of an arrow. The motion was unhurried, almost reverent. He drew the arrow, its sharpened flint head glinting darkly in the sun. He didn't raise the bow to aim. Not yet. He simply knocked the arrow to the string. The soft, dry click of the arrow settling into its notch was the loudest sound Kale had ever heard. It was the sound of a lock turning. It was the sound of a line being crossed, a vow being fulfilled. It echoed in the sudden, profound stillness of the town square, a declaration more powerful than any amount of gold. The bidding was indeed over. A new currency had just been introduced to the market. As his thumb rested against the taut bowstring, the present dissolved. The heat of the sun on his skin was replaced by the damp chill of a forest floor. The stench of the town square gave way to the scent of pine and wet earth. He was back there, in the moments before his world ended. He saw Anya, not as a tragic ghost, but as she was, vibrant, alive, her laughter a melody that seemed to coax blossoms from the trees. They had built a life in the quiet spaces between the encroaching world of men like Sterling and the fading world of their ancestors. It was a fragile existence, a secret garden they tended with careful hands. He remembered the morning it all came apart. He had been tracking a deer, his bow in hand, when he heard the sounds, the splintering of wood, the shouts of unfamiliar men, and a single, terrified scream that bore Anya's name. He ran, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, but he was too slow. They were frontiersmen, slavers, their faces hard and pitiless. He fought, a cornered wolf fighting for his mate, but there were too many. A club striking the side of his head sent him into a disorienting haze, and a searing pain in his leg, from a hunter's trap they'd laid, left him crippled. They bound him, laughing at his futile struggles, and dragged him back to their camp, back to the smoldering ruins of his home. And there he saw her. They tied her to a post, her dress torn, her face bruised but her eyes still blazing with a fire they could not quench. The next day they brought them both to a settlement, a place not unlike this one, reeking of the same greed. They put her on a block. He was tied to a wagon wheel, his wound festering, his body broken, forced to watch. He saw the auctioneer, a man just like Bartholomew. He saw the bidders, men just like Abernathy and the merchant. And he saw the man who bought her, a man with cold, dead eyes and a smile that promised unspeakable things. Kale had screamed until his throat was raw, pulling at his ropes until his wrists bled. But it was useless. They led her away. He never saw her again. The memory ended as abruptly as it began, throwing him back into the blinding sun of the present. The pain of it, fresh and raw as if it had happened only yesterday, did not cripple him. It focused him. It forged his rage into a spear of ice. He looked past the auctioneer, past the girl, and his eyes settled on Sterling. In Sterling's arrogant smirk, he saw the face of the man who had bought Anya. He saw the face of the entire rotten system that allowed one human to own another. The ghost of Anya was no longer just a weight on his soul. She was at his shoulder, her spectral hand guiding his, her silent scream giving strength to his arm. He was not just saving a stranger. He was rewriting the ending to the story that had destroyed him. The town square was a tableau of frozen figures, a painting of fear and confusion. Bartholomew's jaw worked, but no sound came out. The townsfolk, who had come for a cruel bit of entertainment, now found themselves unwilling actors in a drama that felt dangerously real. They began to back away, creating an even wider circle around Kale, a no-man's land charged with lethal potential. Only Sterling and his two hired guards held their ground, their positions dictated by pride and payment. Sterling, his face flushed with anger, finally found his voice. "Are you all going to stand there and let this filth threaten me?" He snarled, his voice a high-pitched bark. "He has a bow. We have guns. Do something." He gestured impatiently at his two guards, a pair of hulking men whose confidence was visibly evaporating in the face of Kale's unnerving calm. They exchanged a nervous glance. Kale hadn't aimed the arrow at anyone. It was pointed at the indifferent blue sky, yet it held more menace than a loaded pistol aimed at their hearts. There was a certainty in his stance, a complete lack of fear that was more terrifying than any overt threat. They were paid to be tough, not to be martyrs. One of the guards, emboldened by Sterling's fury, drew his pistol. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked was a sharp, ugly sound. "Drop the bow, friend," the guard said, his voice trying for a confident growl but coming out as a strained rasp. "Don't be a fool." Cale's gaze shifted from Sterling to the guard, just for a second. His expression didn't change, but a silent message passed between them. "You do not want to do this." The guard faltered. It was in that moment of hesitation that Cale finally spoke. His voice was quiet, rough from disuse, yet it carried across the square like the tolling of a bell. "The bidding is over." The words were simple, a flat statement of fact, but they were imbued with the absolute finality of a death sentence. It was not a threat. It was a pronouncement. It was the declaration of a new law that had just superseded all others in this dusty square. Sterling, insulated by a lifetime of wealth and authority, could not comprehend a world where his power meant nothing. Humiliation warred with fear on his face. "I am the law here," he shrieked, his composure shattering completely. "I bought her, she is mine, seize him." The standoff was no longer just about a girl on a block. It was a clash of two worlds. The world of coin, contracts, and casual dehumanization, represented by Sterling, against the world of primal justice, grief, and an unbreakable personal code, embodied by Cale. The sun beat down, a silent witness to the tipping point of a man's soul and a town's ugly secret. The breaking point came with a roar of pure, frustrated rage from Sterling. "Shoot him, you imbecile!" he screamed at the hesitant guard. Spurred into action by the direct command, the guard flinched and began to bring his pistol to bear. But the world had already moved on. Cale did not wait. In the sliver of a second it took for the guard to commit to his action, Cale's entire being became an expression of lethal purpose. The bow, which had been pointing at the sky, dipped. The string, which he had held with patient tension, was drawn back to his cheek. The release was not a conscious thought, but a pure, honed instinct. There was a sound like a hornet's buzz, a sharp thwip that cut through the air. The arrow moved with impossible speed, a dark streak against the bright sun. It did not fly towards the guard's chest or head. Kyle was not a mindless killer. He was an instrument of precision. The arrow slammed into the wooden post of the auction platform, not 2 inches from the guard's head. The fletching quivered violently, the sound a vicious hum. Pinned to the wood by the shaft of the arrow was the sleeve of the guard's shirt, trapping his gun arm against the post in a hold more secure than any manacle. The guard cried out a mix of shock and pain, dropping his pistol into the dust. Before the first arrow had even stopped vibrating, a second was already knocked on Cale's bow. The motion was a blur, a piece of dark magic. One moment his quiver was full, the next his bow was armed and ready. The flint head now aimed squarely at the second guard's throat. This guard, wiser than the first, dropped his own unfired weapon as if it were a hot coal, and raised his hands high in the air, his face pale with terror. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. The square, which had been simmering with tension, was now plunged into the absolute zero of shock. Cale lowered the bow slightly and took a step forward, his boots silent in the dust. He was no longer just a man. He was the warrior he had tried to bury, resurrected by grief and duty. His movements were fluid, economical, each one imbued with a deadly grace. His eyes, cold and focused, never left Sterling. The wealthy man, who had been screaming orders moments before, was now utterly silent, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning, primal fear. His world, built on the predictable transactions of power and money, had just been invaded by a force that followed no rules he understood. He had tried to buy a human life, and in doing so, he had summoned a reckoning that could not be bought, intimidated, or controlled. Kyle walked onto the platform, his steps sure and steady on the rough-hewn planks. The wood groaned under his weight. He moved past the terrified, whimpering auctioneer as if he were a piece of furniture. He walked past the guard pinned by the arrow, who was now trying desperately to tear his sleeve free. Cale's entire universe had contracted to the space of the auction block. He stopped in front of Sterling. The man was trembling, his fine clothes looking ridiculous on his cowering frame. All the arrogance had been stripped from him, leaving only a pathetic, frightened core. Kyle looked down at him, and for a moment, the face of Anya's buyer swam before his eyes. The urge to loose the arrow, to grant the final bloody absolution he craved, was a physical force, a tidal wave of hatred. But then he looked at Alara. She was still standing there, her hands bound, watching him with wide, unreadable eyes. And in her gaze he saw not a desire for more death, but a desperate yearning for an end to the violence. Killing Sterling would satisfy his own ghosts, but it would do nothing for her. It would only trap her in a new cycle of blood and retribution. With a shuddering breath, Cale let the tension out of the bowstring. He did not unknock the arrow, but the immediate threat subsided. He turned his back on Sterling, a dismissal more profound than any blow, and faced Alara. He reached out not with the bow, but with the knife from his belt. It was a simple, practical tool, its blade worn from skinning game and carving wood. He said nothing as he sliced through the thick hemp rope binding her wrists. The bonds fell away, landing softly in the dust. She rubbed her chafed skin, her eyes never leaving his face. She was trying to understand him, this impossible man who had appeared out of nowhere like a desert storm. He offered no words of comfort, no grand promises. His actions were his language. He gestured with his head toward the edge of the platform. "Come," he said. The single word was a lifeline. Alara hesitated for only a heartbeat. Then she nodded. He jumped down from the block, landing silently, and turned to help her. His hand was rough and calloused as he took hers, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. As they stood together in the dust of the empty square, the spell was broken. The remaining onlookers, those who had been paralyzed by the spectacle, finally turned and fled, melting into the alleyways and doorways, eager to put distance between themselves and the silent man with the bow. They left Sterling alone with his shame, the auctioneer with his terror, and the guard with an arrow pinning him to his post. Cale and Alara walked away, leaving the town and its rotten heart behind them. Their footsteps were the only sound, a quiet, rhythmic beat against the silence. They did not look back. They walked away from the town, not toward a promised land, but simply away. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and crimson, the colors of a fresh wound. The oppressive heat of the day softened into the cool, dry air of the desert evening. They walked in silence, a space of several feet between them, two solitary figures moving through a vast, indifferent landscape of rock and scrub. The silence was not awkward or empty. It was a necessary balm, a quiet space for the noise of the day to settle. Cale led them along a barely there trail he seemed to know by heart, his senses attuned to the subtle language of the wilderness. After an hour, he stopped beside a small, gnarled mesquite tree and unslung the water skin from his shoulder. He drank, then held it out to her. Alara took it, her fingers brushing his for a moment. She drank deeply, the water a blessing on her parched throat. She handed it back, her eyes meeting his. For the first time she spoke. Her voice was low, slightly hoarse. "Thank you." The words were simple, yet they held the weight of a life reclaimed. Kyle merely nodded, accepting her gratitude as a quiet, solemn fact. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a symbol of his past failure, but as a person. He saw the strength in the line of her jaw, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the resilience that had allowed her to stand on that block without shattering. She was not Anya. The realization did not bring him pain, but a strange, quiet sense of peace. He had not replaced what he had lost. He had honored it. The ghost that had ridden his shoulders for so long felt lighter. Anya's memory was no longer a crushing burden of guilt, demanding vengeance. It was becoming what it should have been all along. A profound, aching sorrow, a scar on his soul that would never fade but would no longer poison everything he touched. He had not defeated his ghosts today. He had simply learned to walk alongside them. As twilight deepened, casting long, purple shadows across the land, they continued their journey. The future was a vast, unknowable territory stretching out before them. They had no destination, no plan. They were two survivors, stripped of everything but the ground beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. But as they walked, the space between them seemed to shrink, not by much, but enough. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, a slow, arduous path toward something resembling healing. But for the first time in years, Kyle did not feel entirely alone on that path. Hope was not a grand, shining beacon on the horizon. It was a small, fragile thing, like a single hesitant footstep taken in the gathering dark, followed by another, and then another.